So it was the Feast of Pentecost, celebrated 50 days after Passover. Pentecost was one of just a few holidays in which all able-bodied Jewish adults were encouraged, actually even expected, to make the journey to Jerusalem to give thanks at the temple. Because Pentecost was a celebration of what they called the first fruits. In this case, it meant the first grain harvest of the new year. Wheat, in this case. And it was a festival in which people would gather and take time to acknowledge the gifts that God gave them and give solemn thanks for what they received. Sort of like our Thanksgiving without commercialization. And because so many people were expected to be there, the population of Jerusalem at this time might double or even more of what it normally was. Streets were crowded. Observant Jews were there for the festival, and curious visitors were there just to see what it was like. And if you walk down any city street, you might hear the babble of tongues from everywhere around that part of the Mediterranean basin. And you would think nothing of hearing people talk and not being able to understand them. That was just normal. And if you were sufficiently introspective, you might see that as a commentary on the hopelessness of people ever truly getting along in the long term. Because if they couldn't understand one another's language, how could they ever hope to understand and accept one another's culture? How could they ever hope to understand another person's spiritual beliefs? Even the regional dialects of the same language were enough to mark people as outsiders. Galileans, for instance, which were most of the apostles. Galileans spoke Hebrew with a sort of a soft country burr that immediately marked them as Galileans, which meant they were country bumpkins. So if you were from Judea and you heard somebody speak and you heard them speaking in the Galilean dialect, they immediately moved into the doofus category. No, you wouldn't have to take anything they said too seriously. And if the apostles themselves gave any serious thought to Jesus' command to go out and teach all nations, they must have realized that it would be impossible for them to do that, because they were just a bunch of guys from Galilee that spoke the Galilean version of Hebrew. They didn't have the language skills to reach out to the entire world. And then Pentecost came. As these earliest followers of Jesus were gathered in a single place in Jerusalem, and there were probably around 100 or so of them. And they were men and women, and they were all gathered from different stations in life, and they were here together in the presence of one another and in the presence of God. And it happened. The Holy Spirit was poured out upon them. The very breath of God, the carrier of life and agency, came roaring out of the heavens with a sound like a freight train, although nobody would think of that analogy for, a couple thousand years. But it was a noise that couldn't be ignored. And this mighty breath of heaven blew into the place where the disciples had gathered, and the power of the Holy Spirit just crackled and danced over the lot of them. It spread through the room, And what looked like tongues of fire, flickering flames of pure energy, danced over the heads of the disciples. And if that wasn't enough, something even more remarkable happened. They began to speak. After standing mute when Jesus was arrested and executed, after weeks of living in fear, of being kind of emotionally whipsawed by the chain of events that had surrounded the death and the resurrection and the departure of Jesus, they began to speak. These disciples of Jesus found their voice. They found their voices. And what voices they were. People around them, strangers from every corner of that part of the world, were suddenly able to hear and understand them as they spoke in many voices, in many languages, but with one message. And the people, they were stunned at first because they looked at these Galileans, and in their heads they thought, doofus. But what they heard was someone speaking their language so that they could understand. And this idea of somebody that you never expect being able to speak your language. That made me think of a clip from a movie. Let's see the video, please.
I'm sorry, I don't understand.
Because they say can't hang.
Oh, stewardess.
I speak German.
Oh, good.
He said that he's in great pain and wants to know if you can help him.
All right, would you tell him to just relax and I'll be back as soon as I can with some medicine?
Just hang loose, blood. She will catch up with a beat out on the medicine.
What it is, baby? My mama raised no dummies. I done her right.
Got some scared, Jack. Jumping when they have jumping.
Totally unexpected. Only nobody walked away from this message that they were hearing. Luke tells us that over 3,000 people were baptized that day. After that remarkable display of the Holy Spirit's power. 3,000 converts in a single day. Not a bad start to the week. There's a whole ton of stuff that we could unpack here. I'm not going to take time for that this morning because we've had a lot already today to think about, and we've got a few more things happening. So I just want to hit up a couple of quick things. Quick as I can be. First thing I want to mention is that this event was unique. The pouring out of the Holy Spirit in this case was unique. And it wasn't because of the Steven Spielberg special effects, the wind and the flames and the energy, like Indiana Jones, except nobody's face melts. Because ever since God had started appearing to people in the Old Testament, there was always that kind of flashy stuff going on. You think about the burning bush and about Mount Sinai and things like that. All of the flash is part of the idea of theophany, part of the idea of a physical presence of God manifesting here. But what made it unique on Pentecost is that the Holy Spirit was poured out upon many people that day. Like I said, probably more than 100 early believers. And in all of prior history, when the Holy Spirit came, it came to an individual. It came to a person who would then become a prophet. And it came for a specific purpose and for a specific time. But on Pentecost, that idea was multiplied 100-fold. And it was no longer just for a specific purpose or a specific time. Well, I guess maybe a specific purpose, because the purpose is to enable these people to change the world. But it wasn't for a specific task for a limited time. This time, the Holy Spirit came to stay. And it came to enable those who follow Jesus to accomplish great things, each according to the gifts and abilities that they are given. On Pentecost, the Holy Spirit said, okay, something new is about to happen here. We're going to stay until the job is done. Pentecost was not a singular act either, because we receive the Holy Spirit still today when we're baptized, when we're confirmed, in those times when we are engaging in Christian life and accepting the blessings of God in our life, we receive the Holy Spirit. You don't think about it, but we do. That's one thing. Second thing, something very specific made that day possible. If you read between the lines, you would discover that it would not have been the same event if all of those followers had not been gathered together. And that tells us that presence is a powerful part of being a follower of Jesus. It's a powerful part of being a part of the Christian church. And that means presence in the community, it's presence in the church, presence with the people that we serve, presence with the people that we worship with. And that doesn't mean God is taking attendance. That's not what it's all about. It means that through the Holy Spirit we are blessed with a multitude of gifts, but if each of us is not then present to share that gift, we're kind of squandering the strength in numbers that we should have. Think of it this way. If there had been just a couple of followers in that room on Pentecost, the Holy Spirit would have arrived with all of the noise and the lightning and all of that, and there were like 3 people there. And the Holy Spirit would be going, okay, we're kind of short today. Must be a holiday weekend. So you're going to get the gift of speaking in Pamphylian Greek. You'll get the gift of speaking in Parthian. You will get to speak Egyptian. And we'll just have to forget the rest. That's what it could have been. The people had not been gathered in strength. Through the work of the Holy Spirit, everybody has gifts. And the thing is, you may not obviously see what your gift has to do with church. But it does. You know, music may not be your thing. We're blessed with a wonderful music ministry here. But it may not be your thing. I know it's not mine. I've been told that repeatedly. It's just not your thing. Okay. But you might say, you know, I really like carpentry. Cool. Chances are there's other people in the congregation with the same interest, the same gift. And if you get together, you might eventually find that your gift leads not just to fellowship, but to doing something else for the community. You may not think knitting is a gift. I think it's magic. Give somebody some yarn and all of a sudden they produce this. Well, maybe not all of a sudden. But they produce this garment. But there are people in churches who have groups that not only teach knitting, but then they go on and they make little hats and blankets for kids in the neonatal intensive care unit. That's a ministry. It not only involves people in the church, maybe people in the community, it's also doing good for somebody. That doesn't happen if we are not present with one another to support and encourage each other. It doesn't happen if we are not present with one another to share the gifts that we have and to explore how they might become part of the ministry. Or even how they might be employed in the operation of the church. If we're not even there to start the conversation, who knows what opportunities are being missed? Pentecost is a pivotal day in the history of the church. It's considered the birthday of the Christian church. But it's also a day to be reminded that there is power in presence. Power from being in the presence of God. Power in being present to support one another in worship and in our own faith journeys. Power in being present to support the operations of the church. And maybe most of all, there is power in being present in the community. Show our neighbors that through us, Jesus Christ is also present there. And that helps us start a conversation with people who need to hear the good news. So on this day of Pentecost, we wish you a happy birthday for the church. We hope you remember